hopping right on over to the table because we already have game number 2 or round number 2 underway. And Matt, why don't you take it away and describe what we're going to be seeing once I bring the camera back up.
What the fuck is this? I guess I'll take the consider.
Cool.
And I'll get those names swapped around. It does look like we wind up having the Goryo's Vengeance deck currently on 16 life and 18 life for the Dimir midrange deck.
So it looks like Jimmy is playing face up here. Has a frog in hand. Probably just gonna play it on turn 2. Yep.
Forgot to turn on the camera.
Ooh, Jimmy immediately with the answer to the frog. This is one of those things that is pretty crucial for the Goryo's deck. An unanswered frog can kind of just run away with the game for the Dimir Murktide player.
Yeah, so just very quickly, Prismatic ending that away. Most importantly, with these face-up Unearths, not going to be able to be brought back from the graveyard.
I'll take one.
So it looks like just the passing of the turn, we are going to have a quick fetch here.
It's a disaster.
And unfortunately, it looks like the players accidentally clicked a button on the life total pad, so the life totals went away for a moment. And it looks like we do have Akira out there going to be fixing the life total pad for everybody. This should just be Brian fetching down to just 1 life, so going to be going down to 17. Finds a basic swamp.
Interesting. Kind of unsure why Brian is fetching basics so early in the game, but
I mean, are we worried about, like, I don't think we're on, like, main deck Harbinger of the Tide scenarios, are we?
I don't believe so. Maybe worried about milling over fetchables or something? It's hard to say.
Potentially, and it looks like that we did wind up losing the camera again, so we will second. And it looks like there we go. We did have the play that we were talking about in our radio stream of Unearth Necrogoyf, which was going to be starting to come across for a decent amount of damage coming out from Jimmy's side.
Yeah, Jimmy has a decent board here. Necrogoyf and Frog. Brian does have the Frog though, so at any point, Brian could just find Fatty, play Goryo's, and get right back into this game. Brian is really low though, so hard to say if it's. I wonder what he could be tanking on here. Could be like a another removal spell for a frog.
So it is thinking really hard about this one. May just be thinking about potentially pitching something in order to grow the frog.
It's currently 4 because I 4 5.
Yeah, it could be. So, Goyf right now is a 4/5. It looks like. And if Goyf is a 4/5, Brian currently has 4 cards in hand. Could be a little awkward to try to attack past the Goyf.
And so it looks like just coming back, we're going to start off with a Thoughtseize. We get to see what Jimmy's working with. Just a pair of lands over there. So 2 free damage.
Brian's down to 5 now. This is kind of scary.
So, I mean, if we have to, like, fetch Shock and then Goryo's or something, we're getting pretty low. But, oh, it looks like this is going to be, was it Sentinel, the Lost Souls?
Emperor of Bones.
Emperor of Bones, that one. I got the wrong type of royalty. So this is going to be one of those Unearth type effects, but it is going to take a couple of turns to get online in order for Brian to reanimate something. Most importantly, it's going to take a couple of turns for him to find something to put in his graveyard because he's got nothing right now.
Yeah, Brian has no fatties. Neither does Jimmy. So Emperor for the foreseeable future is just going to be a 2/2 here. Okay, consider that's a pretty good redraw.
Most importantly, we could potentially put something into our graveyard to grow our Goyf. It looks like with that Mishra's Bauble exiled that there was no artifact in the side of Jimmy's graveyard as well, so that will grow the Nether Goyf by 1.
So it looks like Goyf is back to 4. And Brian has 2 cards in hand, it appears.
Yeah, we got 2 face-down cards on Brian's side. We are just going to start getting some attacks here from Jimmy. We know that there's 2 face-up lands that are in Jimmy's hand. He can discard those to pump his own frog if he wants to. Is this going to be a flying frog battle?
Jimmy is letting Brian go to blocks. Brian... This is very awkward for Brian because it clearly looks like Brian doesn't really have either Goryos or the Goryos plus Fatty. So Emperor here doesn't really do much. But neither would Frog. Hard to say. Brian is going to have to block one of these creatures here. My guess is the plan is block with Frog, hope to scry and it tracks them to the graveyard, or surveil and it tracks them to the graveyard of the fetch land. Oh, wait. Brian just discarded an Ulamog. Okay.
All right.
Okay,
So we
that's
got
something.
Fatty.
Interesting. There's Oculus. But if Jimmy has absolutely nothing here, Brian will be able to reanimate this Ulamog with Emperor Bones. And because of how Emperor Bones exiles the Ulamog and then puts the Ulamog into play, Ulamog will see itself and come in with 10 counters.
So that's going to be a big old boy. That's going to be the biggest Fatty you could probably get here.
Yeah. Jimmy's board is actually about to go disappear. Yeah, it looks like Brian's moving in combat. Exiles the Ulamog.
It's going to be Annihilator 10. It's going to be a 17.
Yeah, it's gonna. Yeah, like Brian said, it's gonna be Annihilator 10. Wow. Okay.
All right. So out of nowhere, Brian is going to take that game off the back of an Emperor of Bones and an Ulamog.
Wow, that was kind of surprising.
Never didn't have it, I guess.
Yeah, I guess Brian always had the Fatty.
So that's got to be a little soul crushing if you're Jimmy there, because you basically had everything you could potentially want from there. I guess the only thing we could have maybe seen is giving the Frog flying, since we had Jimmy had 2 piles of cards that were basically representing what was pumping another Goyf and then additional cards in the graveyard. I don't know, since we did wind up unfortunately losing the camera for part of that game, so thanks again to Akira for fixing that for us, and apologies to anybody who was watching and listening to our radio broadcast. We don't know if there was a point in time where we could have discarded one of those lands to pump the Frog to get Brian down lower from Jimmy's side, so a flying attack could have been lethal. We do know that Brian could have just blocked with his own flying frog, but then would have been in a situation where maybe a couple turns earlier couldn't pitch that Ulamog there, but still Brian just poised, calm, and making sure he used that life total as a resource to get himself into a winning position.
Yeah, this is one of the really difficult things about the Dimir Murktide list is when exactly do you pitch to Frog? Because Frog itself, right, it accrues a ton of card advantage, but it does only come in with 1 power, and so depending on how early you start pitching to the Frog, you're taking a gamble here where, you know, obviously you're losing cards here, but being able to close out the game is really relevant for these Frog tag decks because obviously you can't draw every answer in the world.
No.
That game, if Jimmy had discarded, you know, those 2 lands in his hand earlier to the Frog, dealt 2 extra damage to Brian. Brian would be at 3. Jimmy would have 2 lethal attackers, in which case Brian would have had to chump with the Emperor Bones in that situation. So, you know, it's these very fine margins with the Dimir mid-range deck.
And it's kind of always been that way with like these. I mean, this one isn't a Murktide deck. I don't want to get, you know, excommunicated from the format by calling it a Murktide deck with no Murktide in it. But for these like mid-rangey control Murktide, like the evolution of like the modern Delver deck kind of style of decks, it's basically if you line up your cards correctly, you have a very powerful deck. But if you don't play the right thing earlier in the game, later in the game it can kind of snowball into a point where you don't have the proper response to something.
Yeah, exactly. So we're moving to sideboards. there's not too much that the players should be doing with sideboarding here. Jimmy obviously has probably have some graveyard hate, some counter spells he can bring in, but these new iterations of Goryos, because they're so reliant on Emperor Bones, you can't actually just like cut all your fatal pushes.
Right.
So it is kind of a delicate dance on like how much graveyard hate or like extra counter magic you're supposed to bring in. On Brian's side, there's not much. I would imagine Brian already has the Thoughtseize as main deck. I don't think there's actually much Brian would bring in this matchup.
Does it change knowing that Jimmy is not running things like Murktide and then is relying more on this sort of Unearth package? Does that make it a little bit more appetizing if Brian has anything to hate out opposing graveyards as well, or that Oculus plan as well?
That's a great question. So the grave hate that most Goryo's decks play is Nihil Spellbomb, and Nihil Spellbomb does seem relevant here because shrinking the Necrogoyf, making it so the Unearths and the Abhorrent Oculuses are very awkward from Jimmy's side. I could definitely see Brian bringing in Nihil Spellbombs here.
Yeah, most importantly, does not hit his own graveyard, so he can keep his fatties in the yard and then just get rid of what Jimmy's trying to do, and then buys him basically a bunch of time on the clock as well, as he's not going to be facing down a Goyf that has 4 or 5 power and instead is maybe at 0 or 1. We are going to see immediately Jimmy starting off just with a land and passing the turn, and then Brian going to be doing the quick same thing with a Surveil. And that's a great
okay, okay.
We could be in for a very fast round here.
Yeah. Oh man. You hate to see it as a Dimir, as the person sitting opposite at Goryo's, the turn 1 Surveil.
Oh, and it looks like there was a spell bomb that was put into graveyard as well from Jimmy's side.
Oh, the top card of the library. Oh man.
Oh no.
Very unfortunate. This is really awkward here. Jimmy has frogs, probably has Bowmasters in his deck. Probably kind of wants to just jam like a frog on turn 2, but really awkward when your opponent can just Goryos and Atraxa the next turn.
Yeah, then you have that little 1/2 frog going up against a 7/7 flying vigilance, death touch, lifelink.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that Brian is probably going to find at minimum 2 or 3 additional cards from that. And it looks like, Thoughtseize here coming out from Jimmy could potentially snag away the Goryos if Brian has it, but that's going to be met by Force of Negation.
Okay, that seems like a very strong tell that Brian has a Goryos in hand right now. Generally speaking, you don't want that. You don't want to be forcing Thoughtseizes, taking that card disadvantage. I will say, if Brian does go for the Goryos here, it's not the greatest Goryos in the world, because the Atraxa will obviously draw Brian 2 or 3 cards, but yeah, okay. The Atraxa isn't going to stick around, so Jimmy does have a chance to untap here, hold up some counter magic.
Yeah, the most important part here is, unlike a Gristlebrand that can just draw a ton of
Oh
cards.
no, oh no, don't do it, okay. Okay, so Jimmy's going to go for the Boggart to try to exile Brian's graveyard, but it does look like Brian is probably just going to Goryos in response.
And that will mean that the Atraxa goes away on Jimmy's end step, which then means that we're just basically going to have Brian using Goryo's Vengeance as a potential draw spell.
Yeah. Also, just want to say, incredible swamp from Brian there.
Is that the Guru swamp?
Yeah, that looks like the Guru swamp.
It's got the moon in the background, and dang, this is a pretty good Atraxa reveal here. So we find Ulamog, we find Replacement Atraxa, we find 3 lands. It looks like there's an Ephemerate, a Goryo's Vengeance, a was it Tainted Indulgence, and a Mystical Dispute. So we're probably taking Goryos as our instant. We get our big fatty, and we get our land, and now we just need a way to discard it.
So Brian does have a Tainted in hand that I saw. So Brian does have the discard outlet, but I don't know why Brian took... I thought I saw a second Goryos in Brian's hand, so I'm kind of surprised Brian isn't taking the Ephemerate here.
Yeah, if there is no second Goryos, it makes a lot of sense. But like you said, if there's a Goryos in hand, the Ephemerate would have been the way to keep that creature around. Now, the one thing that Brian doesn't have is land 3 on the battlefield yet, so it's still going to be an additional turn before Brian can pitch that card, Goryos and Ephemerate.
Yeah, it looks like Brian is still tanking about what to take here. I'm also kind of surprised Brian is going for the yeah, so Brian is taking the Ephemerate.
Okay.
I'm kind of surprised Brian is taking the Ulamog here instead of the second Atraxa. Oh no, it's because the first Atraxa will be exiled, right?
Yeah.
So then this new Ulamog will see that Atraxa and have Annihilator 7.
So that's going to be a lot, and that right now will be more than Jimmy has on the battlefield. So that could potentially just be a board wipe from his side. But as you mentioned, Brian is just going to have to play land and pass at this point. And now Jimmy knows there's Goryos, or potentially knows there's a Goryos because Brian did not take the first one. There's an Ephemerate and an Ulamog on the other side of the battlefield. So you're assuming that Jimmy is going to be playing very light to the board and bluffing some sort of counter magic or just having it.
Can't tell exactly what Jimmy has in hand here, but does have a redraw with the Bauble. Interesting. So I assume Jimmy has to have no other lands in hand here, because playing the Otawara does seem a little bit scary into the Ulamog.
Oh yeah, like Otawara against the Goryo's Vengeance deck is one of those things that if you bounce it back to their hand, and you know they don't have the ability to replay a 10 or 7 mana with multiple colors in it very easily. So keeping that one in hand, this kind of says that by Jimmy playing this one rather than keeping it in hand, I'm sorry, that I need my 4th land and I don't have another one.
Yeah. Brian going for the Surveil here, and then probably going to go for the Tainted Indulgence.
What could Brian be tanking about right here? If there's what card on top would he not want to be putting immediately into the graveyard? Ooh, the spell. Okay, that's decent.
Yeah.
Oh, didn't Tainted Indulgence end of turn?
Weird.
Does he not have it? Is the question.
I think I saw it in his hand.
Just going to pass there. I guess maybe just playing the waiting game, knowing that you still have a couple of turns to go, waiting for Jimmy to get impatient and then responding with the Tainted Indulgence since you don't have to play that one immediately. But this is now a staring match. This is who's going to act first, and Jimmy is probably ever so slightly favored because Jimmy does have something on the battlefield that is threatening to end the game in 5 turns, but is still threatening Brian's life total.
What's really interesting is that Jimmy is not cracking this Bauble. I would have assumed Jimmy would want to cash in for the card as soon as possible just to find some more interaction. I'm not entirely sure what the rationale here is for keeping this Bauble around.
We already know that by playing the Otawara, probably doesn't have a fetch in hand, so it's not keeping that around for that. Might want to be waiting until after a fetch land comes in from Brian to get a little bit of information, but I mean, could have done that last turn as well.
Yeah.
Instead, we're just going to wind up getting a consider here. Jimmy in the tank a little bit about this one. Might just be, I mean, Goyf is probably something you could be considering right now. You may be thinking, do I want to play that? Do I want to bin that? Do I want to just keep it in hand? Assuming that Jimmy has some sort of, oh, okay, so that's just Spell Pierce. Gonna put that one in the graveyard and, well, finds a fetch land. So now we have 4 mana available.
Yeah, Spell Pierce getting to the stage of the game where Spell Pierce just isn't super relevant. Okay, so it does look like Jimmy was saving the Bauble to help fix his own draw.
What do you think that says from Jimmy's side then? Since I see an Unearth in hand, and that's all I can really make out. So if you're bobbling with your fetch and you're trying to put something better on top, what does that mean about his hand?
This has to be a sign of Jimmy digging for a specifically like counterspell or something. Jimmy doesn't have a hard counter right now, would be my guess. The fact that Jimmy has the Unearth and didn't choose to cycle it is also kind of surprising to me. Obviously, no target right now for the Unearth. I kind of just want to start cashing in some of my cards to, find some more action.
Let's see what we wind up doing here from Jimmy's side. And looks like, oh,
Okay, so
Abhorrent Oculus. Okay.
just casting Oculus. Pulling up 1 mana.
All right, so we didn't have interactive spells, but what we did wind up having was a lot of pressure on the battlefield. So now, if Brian doesn't have something to put that Ulamog into play, the Oculus, the Bogart, and the Manifest are going to be a very powerful combination to close this game out just potentially next turn, but there's that Tainted Indulgence we're talking about. We pitched the Ulamog. We know that there's an Ephemerate. We know that there's a Goryo's Vengeance in hand. Jimmy doesn't know about the Goryo's Vengeance, but does know about the Ephemerate. And, oh, he actually is just going to... This was on the stack with the Abhorrent Oculus. So that's just going to be a Mystical Dispute getting rid of that one. And so the Unearth comes into play now, but now Jimmy down to 1 card in hands. That's just signal off for Brian.
Yeah, I wonder if Brian was playing around Spell Pierce. That's why they didn't Tainted Indulgence last turn. If so, that would have been a pretty heads-up play because Jimmy's not presenting a clock. You have time to just... If it's free for you to play around a specific card, you might as well. And in this situation, you know, waiting a turn, finding the Mystical Dispute for Jimmy's threat seems pretty good. Jimmy's tapped out here.
Get a Manifest Dread on Brian's upkeep, but I mean, we're about to face down an Ulamog that's going to be, I think you said Annihilator 7, which will could get rid of all of Brian's 5 lands, the Manifest Dread, and whatever else Jimmy wants to sack there. But then we know that there's an Ephemerate, so that Ulamog is also just going to be sticking around.
At this point, I don't even think that Ulamog needs to stick around because Jimmy's at 16. The Ulamog is going to come in as a 17-17.
Oh,
so,
well, that's just dead.
or no, sorry, 14-14. Never
Okay.
mind. So, yeah.
Oh,
okay,
yeah, he's just going to go for the Goryo's Vengeance, and Jimmy says, I don't got anything, I'm tapped out. And that's going to be Brian Wang taking game number 2 and taking the 2-0 here in round 2 of the RCQ.